Thank you, Professor Evans. We have about half an hour, so a lot's been said by Raja and Paul. So what I'll do is that I will request that you keep your questions and comments short. We take questions in groups of 3. Please identify yourself as well. So can we have the first round of questions, please? Yes, sir.
Yeah. My question is directed to Professor Raja Mohan. I think economics play a very important part. Do you see India having some arrangement, trade arrangement with Japan? You know, Japan is very interested in expanding to the region. They have done, or they are trying to do in ASEAN, and they're looking at India. And they have been to India before. Many years ago, I've seen them operating there. But do you see this intensification of trade agreement and arrangement? Because, put it this way, China will never be a friendly competitor. In business, there are no friends. Okay, so do you see this happening?
The second question.
This is for Professor Evans. You know, any thinking on the security architecture that China moving so fast assumes that at least the boundaries of Asia are fixed. China is the only one where the boundaries with Japan, with ASEAN, with India, at least they're fixed with Russia, are not yet fixed. Those always are the ones which are causing first pinpricks, and maybe sometime it can escalate into in Japan at least it can get into more than big things. Unless this boundary issue of China, call it containment of China, call it definition of China, is fixed, it's completely open. In India they want the whole state of Arunachal Pradesh. In ASEAN they want the 9-dash line. In Japan of course they just want an island. So unless they fix this, the rest of them are always going to feel insecure. How much can the trade and architecture, well, unless you fix the boundary of the biggest power in the region?
Rahul? Yeah, I'm Rahul Mukherjee from the South Asian Studies and the South Asian Studies program. Well, people are always complaining that I'm very loud. My wife complains the most. My question is that one way of looking at this is that India is being reactive. The other way of looking at this is that what else can it be? If you look at the global distribution of power within Asia, the Chinese economy is more than 2.5 times the Indian economy, 3-4 times now, and it keeps going. In terms of military strength, well, it may not be hegemonic at the world stage, but if you look at the distribution of power in Asia, it's pretty much hegemonic. Now, if you think of Gramscian and other sort of notions of hegemony, the Gramscian notion of hegemony can also be married with realist notions of hegemony or constructivist notions of hegemony, depending on what kind of a normative order do you want to build. Of course, if you have great power, you can, like John Eikenberry was arguing before George Bush, that the United States could construct a liberal order. In some senses, the onus is on China right now, and everybody else will have to be reactive because it is the preponderant power. And if Raja is more realist, then obviously the conclusions are there that you'll have a balance against that power. I mean, I'm not sure whether he's that realist, but if he's that realist. But if you're more of a constructivist, a realist idealist, and you're trying to create a moral purpose around an order, at the end of the day, then you can actually construct it. And I think what the world will be looking at is, what is your moral purpose? I mean, if you're an idealist, if you're a realist, then you've sorted out, your questions are already answered, right? Because we know we have standard paradigms in realism that produce outcomes. It can be bandwagoning or balancing or what have you. So my question to you is that what is the moral purpose of Chinese hegemony to which the rest of Asia will have to react? And from that vantage point, I think everybody has to be reactive. I think it's unfair to say that ASEAN is being reactive, or because you have a very, very big and powerful player, and to that extent, I think we are all realists. We don't have a democratic world society of sovereign equality, and normative orders haven't pushed us in the direction of some kind of spiritualism that produces empathy of a kind that Kant might want, not Hobbes. So I'm sort of pushing you in the direction of where do you think are the Chinese leading the Asian order?
Thanks, Rahul. Maybe you can both, you can start first.
Well, I don't know. Is my voice enough?
Yeah.
No, can you hear in the back?
Yeah, most certainly.
I'm usually accused of speaking loudly, too.
And you speak very well and clearly.
Well, Canadians are very marketable in the United States. One of the things Canadians do best in the United States is news anchor people, because the Canadian accent is seen as a Midwestern accent, and it's a counterbalance to conservative Americans from the South who speak more slowly than we do.
With a draw.
With a draw. With a draw. Well, these are interesting subjects. And let me just make an initial comment on both of the questions, is that you're taking China pretty seriously. To make a case that the region needs to react to China is a fascinating comment. If we had this meeting 10 years ago, would we have been having this discussion? I don't think so, or at least not in the way we are now, that we need to react to China. We know China's big and important, but the game has changed. My sense is that has a lot to do with the calculation of a somewhat diminished, at least relative diminished role of the United States. That we have to ask a new kind of question now. And excuse me, in Singapore and elsewhere, and maybe even in Delhi, the question is how do we respond to this? Now, I draw a distinction between being reactive and being proactive in working with the Chinese. As I have looked at the content of the Indian-China discussions in the think tank world and others, and I might be mistaken, but what I have seen is that it is very much around the management of bilateral issues and immediate security questions. Some of them are the territorial issues, boundary issues that were raised by the gentleman in the front row. That the agenda, as framed by Delhi, is essentially about dealing with 25 questions that are of immediate interest. My sense is that in the China case, they do that too, but they're also looking at another game, which is the game of where is this region going to be in 10 years? Now, authoritarian systems have their advantages. And even Mr. Modi cannot make the guess that he's going to be in power in 10 years from now. Is that fair to say?
5.
5, now 4, and then we get into this. And so the Chinese, partly because of the nature of their system, but I think it's more than that. And let me put out a proposition to you about China. On boundary questions, the territorial state, boy, those are tricky. They have to live in a neighborhood. My hunch is in 10 years we're still going to be discussing territorial sovereignty questions in the South China Sea. That those China's been pretty successful at solving its border relations, its land border relations, with most of its neighbors. India is an important counterexample to that. And I have a hunch it isn't going to be solved in the next 10 years. But my sense is what's going on in Beijing now, when I look at a historical parallel, they deal in the practical world. They're also dealing some bigger thoughts on where it goes, China's interest. And I'm trying to think of a parallel. Where have we seen this in other countries? The one that comes to my mind is the United States between 1945 and 1948, when, for reasons that are a wee bit different, suddenly your power capabilities, America, at the end of the war, America didn't know what the post-war order was going to look like. Sure, there have been some discussions around the United Nations system, what emerged as the Bretton Woods system. But the consolidation of those ideas, to me, took place between 1945 and 1948. It took place when guys like Hans Morgenthau, who were theorists and academics, could work with people like the George Kennans and the Walter Lippmanns, who were the journalists. And what we know as the post-war international order, American realism as a philosophy that was part of that order, or at least that coincided with it, helped it out. This was a pretty remarkable few moments. And over that 3-year period, you know, as I tried to chart where American thinking went, a lot of things consolidated. Well, and some of that was really big picture stuff. You mentioned, they didn't call it a liberal international order in them days, but it did have ingredients of it that later could become that doctrine. And I put to you the proposition that unlike any other capital in Asia, the only place where there are these peculiar ideas bubbling and moving that are not just governmental, this is in China right now. So the big picture thinking there is interesting. And that whether you want to frame it as hegemony, the moral purpose, what I find fascinating is in our discussions with Ministry of Foreign Affairs people and the PLA, gosh, they're fascinating because they do think about moral purpose. Not quite in the way Immanuel Kant did, but if you take a subject like empathy, we've been talking recently about moving from confidence and trust building measures to empathy building measures. I mean, in the Japan, China, Korea relationship is a relationship that doesn't show much empathy. Whatever it is, this is negative, the history questions, other things come in. What has been fascinating is that at least at the intellectual level, boy, our Chinese interlocutors want to talk about what empathy means. They use the Chinese character ting for listening, how you listen in a particular way, heart, mind, engaged. And we, you know, they're not, I have a hunch that these discussions might take place in India, though the strategic group that I work out are more like my colleague, Mr. Mohan. You don't ask deep moral questions anymore because you feel they were bankrupted by the Nehruvian period. The Chinese don't have that allergy, and even these, you know, cynical generals that want to talk about forced deployments, how they're going to position ships in the South China Sea to defend their assets. Ask them, what's your moral purpose? Ask them, and they get answers. They're not ones that are entirely persuasive. They're not ones that are entirely thought through. But one thing they say is that hegemony, if we use the Gramscian take, is only going to work if others buy into it. And the challenge is they don't have anything to sell. The China dream is not a dream that is being picked up and run with by many here. How many of you, my students here in Singapore, in China, in the United States, and Canada, they say, yeah, we knew what the Americans offered. It was the American dream. Now, what that means was a little bit vague. They say what we hear about the Chinese dream doesn't sound so good. Harmony is not a bad idea, and harmony is a key concept they still want to talk about. But the Chinese don't have something to sell. So is there a moral purpose where they're going to try and influence others in the region to behave more like China? I don't think so. But is there a moral purpose where they say, we have to diminish the concerns and the apprehensions of our neighbors? We've got to find a way to live with them and not to frighten them. That's something they do think about.
Just want to add, I think I agree with Paul that I think even when you go to Shanghai or Beijing, I mean, you don't, even if you just read what they're writing, I think the quality of the discourse in China, I think on international relations, strategy has dramatically increased in terms of how they think of the world, the question of institutions, order, and in fact they've mastered the Western discourse. With all the thousands of students that went and there's a craze for the Ivy League and the kind of mastery that they've produced from the Western discourse. At the same time, they're also exploring their own past to produce new ideas. So I think there is this extraordinary vigor, vitality in the way Chinese today are debating their position in the world. So I think there is that consciousness of a rising power that has arrived, and a power that is ready to take responsibility. And I think a lot of it is an advance from where Deng Xiaoping told them something completely different. He said, keep a low profile, don't take the lead, hide your capabilities, bide your time, rather than show off what you have. So I think it is not that they've abandoned the advice of Deng Xiaoping, because I think as the last 5 years, the Chinese leadership is saying, okay, all that is fine, but let us contribute something. That is the addition to the character that they made. Yes, we'll keep a low profile, we won't take the leadership, but we must start contributing a little bit. That is the new addition, and I think within that framework, I think they're beginning to look out. Is India reactive? Yes. I think India is in the Deng Xiaoping phase. I think the reform is slower, your capabilities have increased. Certainly, India is today the 9th largest economy, 8th largest spender of defense. This was not India's position 25 years ago. But it's still a Dengist approach that, look, stay calm, look, don't try to project yourself. And much of the problem for India has been, how does it adapt, because it had fallen behind. Now how do you catch up? But I think democracies have a problem and they're slower. How slow we are and reactive, the Chinese are waking us up. So we must really be grateful for the Chinese, because you can no longer be, ignore what's going on around you. Because I think what the Chinese have done with their Silk Road initiatives, what the relationship with our neighbors, the fact is that today China is not just a problem in the Himalayas, but it is an Indian Ocean power. This is forcing India to rethink a lot. And my sense is, while the reactive approach has been the dominant one, you've also seen Mr. Modi, at least in the last 9 months, to change some aspects of India's China policy. And to the US, that India is today, like what Mao Zedong and Deng did, that you can reach out to the United States to limit Soviet power, but at the same time try and improve your relationship with the Soviet Union as well, which is exactly what Deng Xiaoping did. And I think what India is doing something similar, which is improve your relationship with the US, while at the same time change the dynamics of the China relationship, and don't limit it to the boundary question and the security issues. Today, I think our Prime Minister today is far more open for an economic engagement with China than any of the previous Prime Ministers have been. Manmohan Singh talked the talk, but there was so much resistance to doing more economic cooperation with China. But today, I think there's much stronger appetite today to let the Chinese into sectors that were denied to them as a purely, because the security wallas dominated the economists, and I think that's been a part of the problem. But I think the balance is shifting now. That we saw when Xi Jinping comes to Delhi, there's this massive problem going on the border. But at the same time, Modi is bold enough to say, look, no, I'm going to do the 2 industrial parks. We're going to start studying Chennai, Delhi corridor. The Chinese are going to do a study on high-speed train corridor. So I think the attitudes are changing. I would say change, and I would say Japan has a key role in playing the game differently. That I think the 2 reactions. Problem is, the reactivity is not the problem. How do you react is the issue. Because the Chinese Chinese GDP is 4.5 times larger. India is 2 trillion, Chinese are close to 8.5 something. Indian defense expenditure is 40 odd billion, Chinese is 160, 170. So I think the scale is going up. So the question is, do you react like the UPA government, which is, it reacted by a deer in the headlights? Just paralyzed. Don't do anything. Or the other is, look, you play the game on all sides, which I think is what Modi is trying to do. And Japan, I think, will be a central element of that strategy. Both to expand India's own comprehensive national power on the economic side, on the trade side, and even on the Silk Roads, for example. The Japanese are telling us, look, we can work together to do more things in Burma. Let's think of an Indo-Pacific corridor that connects South Asia with Southeast Asia. If you go to area in Jakarta, they're full of these new ideas. So I think the problem there is not Japan is not ready. It's not that Japan is not ready. India has to get its act together. That both the Americans and the Japanese are saying, look, let's don't oppose the Chinese corridors, but build your own. Chinese are not saying don't build your corridors.
Correct.
So we can do some things with the Chinese, for example, on the BCM corridor where Bangladesh is involved. But at the same time, do your own stuff. So the thing is, do something for God's sake, as they say, do something. I think there's a government which is saying, let's do something, which is a big improvement. Then let's do nothing. a non-alignment is do-nothing strategy.
Roger, is there a strategy, and where is it coming out of? Is it in your brain? Is it in Mr. Moody's brain? Give some of us reason to think that, yeah, there's problems, and there needs to be responses to them. Where are they?
The Chinese are more like the Americans, you know? So they have to debate, they have to organize a doctrine, they have to organize 24 characters, and explain to everyone, the universities have to teach it. Indians are more like the Brits, you know? It's instinctive, imperial, you know, it's absent-minded, you know, how they acquired the whole of Indian territory. That you do it through, not by a grand design, there's no Germanic Teutonic tradition of Britain and, sorry, of the US. So here is, look, I go by what they do, not by what they say. So if you go by what Modi has done in the 9 months, and you can say, look, here is a change vis-a-vis Japan. He's ready to do more things with Japan on high-speed trains. He's willing to play China-Japan competition on high-speed trains. He's doing more with China. He's not afraid of going to Japan and saying China is expansionist. And then going to China and saying, look, we're Asian buddies. So there is, I think, if you go, I'd say go by the actions and draw your own conclusions. And there will never going to be a doctrine which says, look, this is the grand strategy because, and that this is how we're going to play this out. And I think that's going to be part of the problem, figuring out what India does, because unlike the Chinese and the Americans, there's this conscious articulation. And as Britain had found it, they had to respond to Germany's rise, they had to respond to a whole lot of things, and most of it in a reactive manner rather than a pre-planned grand strategy that our Americans want all the time.
Before you hit the 8 hands.
Yeah. 200.
Dr. Jordi first.
Thank you, Sundar. Well, it's a comment more than a question. I find this title of the discussion almost irritatingly constrained. We talk of Asia.
When is it constrained? Feel free to explain.
It hasn't constrained me, happily, but the point is, Asia is not a frame of reference for either side. I mean, you know, Asia is a Greek concept, it's a territorial concept, and nothing that we have said here has made Asia a relevant frame of reference for either China or India. It would be far more interesting to discuss, is there an emerging global order, and in this emerging global order, within that framework, what role is China playing, what role is India playing? If China should use the expression Asia, as it often does, and you're quite right when it says Asia for the Asians, they need Asia with a view to America, in Chung No Wang, what's the China dream, Asia finds no reference. Of course, harmony is central to it, but there is nothing as Asia. So the point I'm making is that having sort of a territorial artificial concept constrains this thing and is not a realistic discussion of what these actors are about. And therefore, both of them are global. They've graduated out of Asia. America is the elephant in the room, as we all know, and therefore, Asia up.
Next question, Rajit.
Yeah. It seems to me that China is trying to construct China-centric Asia. That must be the long-term, probably is the long-term goal, even though they're making concessions to reassure so that countries are not too worried, like the US alliances can play supplementary role, so that after certain steps are being taken and all that. Okay, I mean that may not necessarily be entirely bad, huh? But the system that they have in mind, the order, I mean they don't accept international arbitration. So if in a China-centric order there's a quarrel between an individual state who will be dependent on China in an asymmetric manner, you know, all the individual states will be, you know, they will have no recourse to international arbitration unless the Chinese put up some sort of China-controlled court. Secondly, they don't, the law of the sea is respected only very selectively. Now, did these points come up in the discussions with the Chinese?
I'm Jackie from South Asian Studies program in US. My question is to Professor Rajamohan, and in reference to your mention of the change in attitudes. I mean, could you throw a little more light on how actist would be different from lookist, and whether that has a reference point of Sino-Indian resistance as well?
Thank you very much. We are fortuitous to have two professors who is expert in China and India. Are you able to get your head together to share with us that between China and India, 2 or 3 initiatives which both of you can see eye to eye each other, that you will make it good for this part of the region, or 2 or 3 ideas that you basically would not be able to see eye to eye together. Basically, you would not shake hands, you just go like that, and that's it. And just go away. And I would say one comment.
You have an idea, by the way?
Yes, I do.
Well, give it to us.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not a professor. And the other
makes you
one,
wiser.
the other one, which I would like your thought is, China political system is 5 years and 5 years. That means there's a longevity of political system. And the democratic system in India most likely is 4 years and 4 years and 4 or 5 years. And whenever you change leadership, things change. So I think Singapore we are blessed with longevity of government. So I would like to hear your view that how should that evolve and how would it affect the changes.
Ask 2 questions. Surya first.
Surya from the Institute here. You have made the distinction between important power and indispensable power over the longer term. Do you think the US can extend the longevity of its indispensability by co-opting India? And secondly, do you think China has a chance of becoming the indispensable power over the longer term when it doesn't provide much of global needs anyway?
My question is that state intention has a direct link to state capabilities. Now it's very clear that China's economic trajectory is going to match the US at some point in time. But in the Indian cases, are you sure that India's domestic institutions is ready to support India to play a more major important role in Asia?
Which one of us is older? Well, you look old. I agree with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think this question on domestic versus external. Look, I think we can't choose now change our domestic political system. So there is no escaping that Indian constitution. So whatever you do, there is a problem of continuous political change, a political uncertainty, even a strong mandate from Modi does not automatically translate into a commitment to reform. The whole range, it's a diverse country, multiple, everyone knows India's weaknesses. Those are not going to disappear. I think the interesting question is, look, how has India made progress in spite of those problems? Now, it is the 2 levels to it. What is the net weight of India in the international system? Which is from being marginal to the international system today, India's relative weight in the international system and the regional system has steadily grown because of economic reform, the acceleration of India's economic growth. So that is irrespective of what happens inside. If India's overall size keeps growing, it makes a difference to where the balance of power is. So without doing anything, if you're already the 3rd largest in the PPP terms, with a little purpose, you could make a much bigger difference on the international system. So the question is, look, does the Indian elite move from a phase of ambivalence, uncertainty, towards a more purposeful policy? I think that is the big issue. So it is within that band. That is one part. Second, having a permanent bureaucracy establishment which partly limits the political change. That as the bureaucrats will say, look, ministers come and go. We'll run the country. So which is a part of the problem, and partly it provides the stability as well. So I think within those constraints, the question is what is India's role and how that plays out. But when we talk about external dimension, overall if you say, look, where India was in 1991 and where it is, in spite of all the 30 years of coalition governments, weak governments, it has made a difference. But tomorrow, with a slightly different orientation, with more economic reforms, I would think it will make a bigger difference as well. So I think I'm not worried because there's nothing you can do about it. That is karma. So our democracy is our karma, so now there's no escaping. Second, I think on the India-US agreements and disagreements, I think the US has been ready for for greater collaboration with India. I think it's India that has held back. Because when Bush administration said, look, we'll do a nuclear deal, we'll break all the rules, the Japanese don't like it, the Norwegians don't like it, the Canadians didn't like it, Steve Harper's a nice guy. But that we will not, all that doesn't matter, we want to do a deal with India, we're going to do it. And then they say, look, we want to assist India's rise to a great power status. Because the problem in India is, look, who are you to tell me to, Now, you had the perversity of last 15 years, where you say, look, when the US is ready to deal with you in a different thing, that you're not prepared to fully go. I think, as I said, it's again internal ambivalence, and less ability to play the game. Like Mao Zedong, I give example with Indians. Korean War, Chinese casualties were close to 500,000, half a million, dead and injured. That's in 1950 to 53. From 69, he was begging the Chinese, Americans to please, let's do a deal. Mao Zedong's own son died in the war, in the Korean War. That didn't stop him from reaching out to the Americans and deliberately playing a geopolitical game that would make a huge difference to the way the world evolved post-71. So I think India has been more hesitant. My sense is, but structurally, I think what India and US are going to do are going to significantly increase. And there will be consequences in the relationship with China. The challenge is not to say, look, I'm with the Americans against China, or I'm with the Chinese against the Americans, but how do you build an asymmetric relationship with both? That is, expand more things with the Americans on some level, do some things with the Chinese. I think we have that opportunity, just as Deng Xiaoping had the opportunity in the 70s, the 78 onwards, that we were in a sweet position. India is in a sweet international situation where it can engage everyone for its own national benefit. On the activist policy, look, I think it's an intention, right? Look East and act East now. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. That is, if India does well with Japan, with ASEAN, does more things, like let's more business with Singapore, that it will be proven by record, not by claiming to be act East. Because people will say, okay, you used to say look East, now you're saying act East, I want to see what the difference is. So I think that's going to be judged by history, not by what the government says or what the ministers say. But in the 9 months we've seen there's more activism in Vietnam, there's more activism with ASEAN, but not enough on the connectivity projects. So I think it's a mixed record. It's only 9 months. I think I would say 2 years down the road you see, has the activist policy made a difference to India's engagement with the region?
I realize that as we're speaking, our chairs are speaking as well. You notice this room? There's a whole other dimension of what's going on. I'm sorry. So when with Raja, I kind of get excited, so I start moving around, and that's not meant as criticism. It's full of ideas. This is a really interesting question. I disagree with the premise that Asia doesn't exist. I agree with the idea that it was a construct, came from the outside. I have a hunch now that Asia exists because of power relations. And my theme of the year 2014 is that it's the year that China decided it's becoming a global player, UN and its investment, but that its focus for the Xi Jinping period is going to be Asia. It's not going to be Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific mean including the United States. The U.S. mattered to China. It's the fundamental bilateral relationship. But I think Asia is being reinvented by Chinese practice. And that the instrument of that is those railroads. The instrument of it is material. Remember, Chinese are Marxists. Marxists are historical materialists. They believe in production and power. And the physicality of the Chinese ambassador speaks to us at UBC about a new maritime Silk Road that runs between China and Canada. This is a really interesting idea. It doesn't get much traction, but in Asia, these ideas are getting traction. So I think that you're perfectly right, but that at the same time, Asia is starting to matter in a new way. And I think that this East Asia Summit process, if it works, is going to be the diplomatic expression of that. And it relates then to Daljit's really, really fundamental, important question about China and international law. One of the things we have included in our discussions and in our proposal is a working group on international law of the 21st century. If the law of the sea was being redone now, would it look the way it did when Tommy Cole read it through, what, 50, how many years ago now? More than 30 years ago. Gosh, 74, so my mathematics are weak, but something like that. You see, I think that the idea of China as a lawless society, something that the Japanese have been pushing through the Gaimusho for the last 4 years, that China is lawless because it's run by a communist party that doesn't respect the rule of law in its own country. Boy, that seems to me a real mistake in understanding dynamics internally in China, but more importantly, understanding China and rules. You know, those academics who study Chinese involvement in international regimes, on the financial side, on the use of force. Rosemary Foote's book is pretty important. China has a very good record of complying with laws and rules and institutional, of which it was a part of the creation. It came into the United Nations late. It came into the law of the sea negotiations late. And the question we raise with our Chinese friends is, if the law of the sea was reopened now, in light of your interests, but also your desire for global rules, and what your real interests are, in terms of freedom of navigation and other things, what do you want to see changed in the law of the sea? Boy, that causes them headaches, because that's a political problem to reopen something that is there and is very hard to reopen. It's an intellectual exercise. It relates directly to the gentleman's question about what are the three things India and China might do together. I think one is they should start looking for a free trade area beyond the Asia-Pacific, or Asia and the Pacific, something like that. Get India into APEC, with Chinese leadership getting up there, because of win-win bilateral economic relations put in a framework. But I would say on international law, I think one of the really difficult questions is international law is about power. Hans Morgenthau, the ultimate realist, understood international law as a subset of power relations, but not identical. So why not an India-China thinking group on what 21st century international law should look like? What should be changed? Most of the fundamentals of international law are based on customary law, but also kind of some rulemaking. That rulemaking was mainly handled by the victors of the Second World War, those Canadians who gave you the Declaration, Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I don't mean it was just Canada, it was part of a process at the time. But what would 21st century rules and norms look like in a context of Asia's rise, and particularly these two countries, India and China? Maybe it wouldn't go anywhere, it'd be a very difficult political discussion. But I think many in the world are starting to ask that question, what are the rules going to be in a situation where not just China is more powerful, India as well, and some other countries that shared the benefits of an older system but no longer think it's perfectly compatible with their interests or their visions. So that would be one I would sort of throw back to you. And I'll end with Bilahari Kausikan again, because I think Raja Mohan, remember I called him at the beginning, he's an idealistic realist. What I meant by that, Raja, is that when you ultimately said, India and China are playing a geopolitical game in terms of maximization of influence, power, and the national interest. They're playing that game. But there's another game being played in the 21st century world too, which in very crude terms has to do with economic collaborations. And this region, however we define it, whether it's Asia, Asia-Pacific, or Asia and the Pacific, is the world exemplar in playing a new game a little bit differently than the Europeans did. And this new game is how do we maximize economic interdependence, integration of production systems? How do we get global supply chains working better for our regional neighborhood? And that if you use that lens on what the region looks like, you then get into omnidirectional balance. And omnidirectional equilibrium is the phrase that it's not just a geopolitical game, it's three-dimensional chess game with different things. And the question is whether that game is essentially about winners, a winner and a loser, or can it be a game that is really a contribution to world history of winners for a lot of people, and that the geopolitics, in essence, begin to fade just a wee bit. That's why I'm a realistic idealist, because I think this is a moment of transformation that maybe 1 in 10 chance is going to be able over the next 15 years with that East Asia summit process, that Asia, and maybe as India comes along in the thinking ways that Raja has said, maybe India and China might be able to offer a better future. I kind of like Tagore. I kind of like the Rabindranath Tagore vision of some possibilities. So, was he realist? Was he idealist? Those phrases don't really quite work in his context, but I'm kind of hoping we can get some of his spirit in what an Asian century is going to look like. End of sermon.
I'd like to thank both speakers for what I think will be an interesting dialogue. Thank you for the audience for making this an interesting dialogue. I'm left with the very pleasant task of presenting Professor Evans. Raja, you don't get anything two books both published by Rahul Mukherjee, who's also head of research at ISS. I don't think it talks about constructivism in this book, but it's been fashionable now. Everyone wants to read the book. Okay, sorry. I got to read the book. Okay. So, Paul, thank you very much. Thank you so much. And I hope you get reading material on your way back. Jordan, is it? Tea outside. Tea outside. Thank you.